Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director here in Des Moines, Iowa. And I'd like to thank Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa for their support of this show, for their support of what we do. And Mark, what's going on this week? What is on your mind this morning?
Well, on my mind this morning are the developments from the European Union. I guess they can splay out in all different directions, but particularly, we've heard over the last number of weeks the contention that the European Union has poured money into some of the left-wing non-governmental organizations in Israel. Do you remember hearing that, David?
Oh yeah, there've been lots of discussions. Many of the organizations that operate in Israel, and particularly the organizations that operate in the Palestinian Authority, ones that try to advocate for the Palestinians against the Israelis, and particularly ones that advocate against the settler movement. Those organizations are said to be heavily funded, heavily supported from organizations in the European Union, and in some cases from governments in the European Union.
Right.
I know that NGO Monitor has a whole discussion
right.
of exactly that.
Absolutely, and even some of the NGOs within Israel itself, Adlada, I think, is one of them. A number who are patently, I'd say, biased in their types of reporting. Their political reporting. They have seemingly little to do with human rights and more having to do with opposition to the government of Israel.
Well, and it's absolutely the case. And in fact, what we're seeing right now is there's a growing hostility in certain quarters to Israel. And it seems to coincide with the rise in connection to what's going on in Turkey and a rise in the growth of Islam in those European countries. And Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan on Wednesday described Zionism not only as racism, which is the old canard that is despicable, but he described it as a crime against humanity. He went a step further than racism.
Right.
And he said it was on par with anti-Semitism and fascism. Speaking in Vienna at a United Nations event devoted to dialogue between the West and Islam, Erdogan decried rising racism in Europe and the fact that many Muslims who live in countries other than their own often face harsh discrimination, which is something that we should certainly oppose. We should be striving to better understand the culture and beliefs of others, but instead we see that people act based on prejudice and exclude others and despise them. And that is why it is necessary that we must consider, just like Zionism or anti-Semitism or fascism, Islamophobia is a crime against humanity.
How does one get a handle on dealing with something like that? The fact seems to be, for instance, there was a speaker at Drake University about a week ago from Turkey. It was very good. Spent most of his time talking to the student audience about the history of how the Ottoman Empire gave way to Ataturk and then Kemalism, and characterized the Erdogan regime in Turkey as moderate Islamist. That really does not show the trend that has taken place in Turkey over the past 7, 8, 9 years.
Well, what does moderate Islamist mean here, Mark? When we're comparing, they're moderate Islamists compared to the Taliban.
Right.
But does that mean they're moderate? The answer to that, in my mind, is no, they're not moderate.
Well, the fact that some people use the term moderate Islamism links back to a philosophy having to do with the United States, trying to convince the United States that its policy should be different between extreme Islamists and moderate Islamists. And people like Barry Rubin would say there is no difference, essentially. Islamism is the same a breed that wants to impose Sharia law and its restrictions on society.
I mean, if we look at what Erdogan is actually doing
Yes.
in Turkey, and that this government has arrested judges that have opposed them, has arrested secular leaders, has closed, has curtailed the freedom of speech, has done any number of other things that are anti-Western ideals,
Absolutely.
and that should be anathema to anything that we could possibly support. Here, he's promoting an idea that is functionally beyond normal anti-Semitism and going to just flat-out hatred. And the European Union doesn't react to that.
Yeah,
this actually violates the European Union definition of what qualifies as anti-Semitism.
Right. The fact, though, one would expect that rational individuals in Europe would speak out against that, and that seems not. Well, obviously, look, David, you're going to talk about the push in Europe, in Britain, for more sanctions against Israel. This type of undercurrent really tries to hold sway in how Islamism and the Middle East is seen in Europe. You want to say a few words about the BDS movement in Europe?
Well, look, what's going on is the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement has gained strength in Europe. There's an attempt to get governments to do official sanctions against Israel because getting them done at other levels has failed. And what's really happened is that the military attempts to destroy Israel have failed. And so the anti-Israel movements are now resorting to diplomatic means to try to destroy Israel. And some of them are trying to push just action against settlements, against the West Bank, and others are trying to push action against Israel as a whole. Now, some of the people who are more moderate will say, well, I just want to boycott the
products,
the settlements.
that are coming
I only
out
want to boycott the products and the settlements.
Yeah.
But then the question is what qualifies as a settlement, one. And two, then the question is what happens if you have things that are labeled made in Israel, for example, that are actually made in those settlements, and some of these groups then want to boycott everything made in Israel because they don't know what's made in settlements. Additionally, there's a question of what is the legitimacy of Israeli life in those settlements. Now, we had a speaker here, Eugene Kantorovich, who spoke just a couple of weeks ago here, who noted that it is not illegal for somebody to cross a border and decide to live in a place. You know, the argument being made here is that the Israeli government is deliberately moving population into certain places. And that's really not what's actually going on. What's actually going on is that people are deciding they want to live in those places, and then the Israeli government is having to figure out whether, one, it can be allowed, and two, how to deal with it. Certainly in the environs of Jerusalem, that's true. Now, there may be some places where it's a little bit more ideologically motivated, particularly from the religious side of things. And most of those places, the government has actually opposed the settlement, and some places even removed settlers.
Let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
We were talking about the BDS movement and its effect in Europe. I want to say a few words what just happened in Oxford University.
Yeah, let me get to the article about the Oxford University vote. This was
and why Oxford?
Well, Oxford, I think, is seen as one of the academic centers of the world, and so being able to have the students vote there, they really thought that if Oxford fell toward the BDS movement, that everything would fall. Oxford students voted 69-10 to defeat a motion that would have required them to support and promote the economic and political anti-Israel warfare method known as the BDS movement, and that's really what it is. So the Oxford is as the article says here, an exemplar of academic elite institutions, and it was brought there because they really thought that they had a chance. They had they had professors, they had students who were allied to support this, who brought arguments. They even had George Galloway, I believe, come and speak. And students were discussing the motion, voted in their own colleges. The boy and a student at Magdalen College, which is one of the colleges at Oxford, said, "This boycott goes against everything the university stands for. The idea that we are not going to read your books or articles or hear your arguments on the basis of your nationality is ridiculous." So what you've got is an understanding that the BDS movement at its extreme really is just pushing hatred of Jews in Israel.
Well, the fact is it's extreme. In many cases, if people with criticisms would do something less extreme, it would probably go over a lot better. But the fact is that the people involved in these types of movements do basically telegraph their ultimate goals, leaves it clear what their objectives are. And therefore, when you put something on the table, including a proposed academic boycott, people of fair-mindedness are going to say this is too much. You can't do that.
Well, how about the academic? How about the fact that this academic boycott is exactly what the Nazis did, taking books written by Jews and Jewish scholars out of universities? I mean, it is so ridiculous. It's so anathema to the way that the academic world works today that essentially what the BDS movement is promoting is fascism.
It seems to be. Now, you mentioned George Galloway. Last week or so, he was on the stage and was supposed to debate BDS most probably, and his adversary turned out to be an Israeli student.
A dual citizen.
A dual citizen.
A British and Israeli citizen.
The fellow was what, 24, 21, something like that?
A student.
A student.
Yes.
And Galloway left the stage when he found out that his adversary was going to be an Israeli. That's total bigotry.
Well,
especially,
he's definitely a bigot.
He's a bigot. Okay. Now, I'd like to make the transition to the United States and what happened at Brooklyn College.
Okay.
Do we have
But
enough?
You probably know more about than me. But
okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, what happened at Brooklyn College is that a particular group approached the political science department and said they wanted to have a discussion of the BDS, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and the political science department said, okay. Now, it turns out that the panel discussion was only one-sided to begin with. And there was a big ruckus in New York City, and some people said that from the far right that you shouldn't have this on campus to begin with. So that was a canard. But the fact is you can have a real debate on a controversial topic, but basically you have to make sure what that topic is. In other words, if the BDS movement wants to, as they articulated, to cut off academic relationships with Israel, you are having a free speech debate about cutting off free speech. And I think astounded many people, and I think it astounded people like Alan Dershowitz, who articulated his opposition to that particular program, and his viewpoint was taken out of context. And the answer is yes, you can have controversial stuff, but if you're going to sponsor something like this, and it turned out to be worse than expected because some of the Jewish kids were expelled from the audience, then you really have to question what the role of the academic sponsor is.
And we'll talk about all of that right after our break.